to regional instruments, it really makes a difference, simply because this right empowers those who protect the environment. So we're protecting those who protect the environment and empowering them to improve national policy on environment and climate, national legislation, and of course they can also bring cases, which is happening increasingly before the courts. So there's a proven track record of this right. And so in a sense, the UN was simply recognizing something that already exists. But nevertheless, it was an extremely important moment. I've been following the Human Rights Council for 15 years, and it's the only time I've seen everybody stand up and applaud when a resolution is adopted. And the president of the council, admittedly from a small island state, Fiji, so she would like it, but the camera was looking at her and she couldn't stop but break into an enormous smile. And as I was saying to Ilse yesterday, we monitor the Universal Rights Group, the press, a lot. And again, I've never seen such an outpouring of articles around the world, especially positive articles about the Human Rights Council. Normally it's the Human Rights Council has done this, it's not great, or this country is a member of the Human Rights Council and they shouldn't be, or, you know, atrocities in Syria. But this was a thematic issue, and yet so many articles in major newspapers. So it was really a positive agenda, and I think we need more of that, especially at the moment. But why we're here? We're here because the Human Rights Council recognition on its own is not enough. For it to be fully recognized by the United Nations as a universal human right, the General Assembly also needs to follow and recognize. And in the opinion of myself and others who follow this, that really does need to happen at this session of the General Assembly. Otherwise, momentum will be lost. And all of that good work will not have been for nothing, but it would be such a shame if it doesn't happen now. And at the end of this session, now that we've got the screen working, we will be hearing from different states. Normally, if Costa Rica was able to get in with their vaccine pass, we'll also hear a joint statement from the core group, where we hope they will set in place their plans for the next 2 months in order to push for this historic moment, General Assembly, and therefore full UN recognition of the right to a healthy environment. Before introducing our keynote speakers, we're really pleased and honored that we have such high-level speakers for the beginning. I'm going to pass the floor to my eminent colleague, Dan, who's been at this even longer than I have, and throughout all of those meetings over 15 years, always has the best taste in bow ties. Another very nice one today. Dan, over to you for your words of wisdom.
Thank you very much. Mark is he's understating how many years he has worked on this, in fact, but 15, we'll live with that for right now. Well, we're here. First, thank you all for coming. I know there are other demands on your time. We're here to celebrate, in part. I mean, this is an amazing accomplishment. We've changed the pantheon of human rights. There is now an environmental right, and it's very important what happens in the General Assembly, but we shouldn't underestimate the fact that things have now changed. And so in part, what we'll talk about today is how to actualize that change. And the other aspect of what we're here for is what Mark already said, and that is we're preparing for this, what we hope is a vote in the, or consideration in the General Assembly. And we'll address that kind of issue as the day goes forward. So thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Okay, enough from us. We're very pleased to have with us today Her Excellency Lydia Norona, badly pronounced, sorry, UN Assistant Secretary General and head of the New York office of UNEP. And I should say thank you so much to UNEP, UNICEF, OHHR and UNDP for supporting this event. Honestly, one of the wonderful things that happened in the run-up to the Council's recognition was the global outpouring of support for this. Over 1,500 NGOs and human rights defenders around the world, including thousands of children, supported this and put enormous pressure on states to move ahead. businesses, for the first time I've ever seen on a thematic issue at the Human Rights Council, business got behind this, and the UN agencies honestly played such an important role, repeatedly making speeches. Michelle Bachelet, the High Commissioner, colleagues from UNEP, colleagues from UNICEF, and it really did play an enormous role. So I'm very happy to welcome Ligia. We also have my good friend Ilse Brands-Keris, who's UN Assistant Secretary General for Human Rights. And we then have Kellyanne Naylor from Assistant Director of Water and Sanitation and Hygiene at UNICEF. We now have a screen, so we will be able to see her. We were worried before that only people online would be able to see these presentations, but now we'll be able to see it, hopefully, technology allowing here. So that will be our colleague from UNICEF. And then we have a wonderful video from Adriana Salazar, who is a youth climate activist from Bolivia. After the opening session, we'll have 2 roundtable discussions where we hope all of you will participate, especially those in the room, but also those online by submitting questions and comments in the chat box, which my colleagues will be sending me via WhatsApp, so I can pose them to the panelists. And you know what, I'm going to introduce the panels when we get to them rather than go through everybody's names, but needless to say, an incredible 2 panels of speakers, including the current and former UN Special Rapporteurs on Human Rights and Environment. I'm already behind time, so Ligia, I'm going to pass to you. Very nice to see you. Thanks for all the support of UNEP and our eminent colleague, So Young, who's still working at the back of the room now. But please, over to you.
Thank you so much, Mark. And Excellencies, panelists, ladies and gentlemen, welcome. On behalf of UNEP, it's a real pleasure to have all of you here today. And I really look forward to this roundtable discussions that we following our keynote speeches, so to say, that we really welcome that. So I'm pleased to open this meeting, and one that I hope the history will remember as an important moment in time where we hope to take this forward in terms of an universal recognition of the right to a healthy environment. On 8th October 2021, we heard the Human Rights Council recognized that a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment is a human right. As UNEP's Executive Director, Inga Anderson, noted, the resolution is a shield for individuals and communities against a plethora of risks to their life, health, and livelihoods. It's a landmark decision that we all applaud in our ongoing work on social and environmental justice, and especially intergenerational equity and responsibility. UNEP congratulates all those who made this possible: states, civil society, and indigenous peoples, children and youth, national human rights institutions, business communities, as well as UN entities. The resolution is a result of coordinated efforts of all parts of society, as Mark just mentioned. It evidences the work of working together for a common goal. The resolution is already having positive impacts around the world. It's boosting the implementation of environmental and human rights laws and commitments, triggering accelerated environmental actions, and providing safeguards to people. But ladies and gentlemen, we are far from there yet. We are faced with planetary and human rights crises all the time. More than 9 out of 10 children are exposed to deadly air pollution. An average of 4 environmental defenders are murdered every week. Climate change is forcing people out of their homes. Extreme weather events are creating victims of gender-based violence. The loss of biodiversity threatens livelihoods, cultural identity, and survival of indigenous peoples. We need to do more. Nature and the people are calling to all of us and to the UN to do more for a healthy planet and for the people that we care for and that we stand for. The good news is that there is a clear pathway. It's through recognizing the right to a healthy environment by the UN General Assembly. And that's one of the key moments that we're here today to really think about this in better ways. And conditions exist and a right to take this forward. The right is already recognized by over 80% of UN member states at the national and regional levels, and now by the Human Rights Council at the General Assembly as a principal policy-making body of the UN, and it has a clear mandate to recognize the right to at the global level. The General Assembly has recognized new rights, including the right to water and the rights of indigenous peoples, among others. So there's precedence here. The experience of the Council resolution provides confidence. Contrary to some initial anxiety, the resolution was adopted with an unanimous yes, with 43 states out of 47 voting in favor, and with a co-sponsorship of 78 states. It was already having impacts, and the impacts both on people and planet. A resolution by the General Assembly would have a greater impact on our environment and the lives of everyone. The overwhelming support we had for the Council resolution is still with us, and we hope to build on this momentum going forward. Universal recognition presents a course of history that can't be changed or stopped. Many rights that we accept without thinking twice today were rights that were fought for and did not exist at some moment in history. Excellencies, distinguished panelists, friends, this year we're also celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Stockholm Declaration, in which the right to a healthy environment is rooted. And we're working very hard to make Stockholm Plus 50 something that really helps us take these ideas forward. It's an ideational moment. It's a conference that will not have a negotiated outcome, but it's a conference that will enable us to put good, strong ideas on the table to help many of the other conferences and negotiations that are going on through the course of this year and the next. The world has waited 50 years for the universal recognition of this right. And so this moment is really important. We can't let people wait any longer. The beginning of this history, therefore, can start here today. We have a moment to move together in solidarity and collective action to create a brighter future for all of us and for future generations. We invite you all to join us. Thank you. Over to you, Mark.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Lydia. And as you said, this has been a journey, a long time in the making. And I think the things that for me have characterized that journey have been vision, courage, and determination. And if you haven't guessed it already, one of the goals of today's meeting, and by the way, there's about 470 people participating here and online, including about 90 delegations to the General Assembly, is to send out a message that we need more courage, vision, and determination in this final push for GA recognition of the right. And it's also, of course, the aim of this meeting is to inform delegates here in Geneva, here in New York, sorry, about what this is, what it isn't, and why GA recognition would be so important. I'm now delighted to pass the floor to Ilse, who has also very kindly joined us at this early hour of the day to offer the views of the Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights and her office as the ASG for Human Rights. Please, Ilse.
Thank you very much, Mark, and good morning, Excellencies and colleagues and friends. It's really an important moment to be here. So I'm very happy that we are already generating this sense of momentum that we will need to go ahead and have the courage to take on the battle ahead. I'm very happy to have the opportunity here in the beginning of this event. We already have mentioned that on October 2021, 8th of October, the resolution, again, 4813 was adopted. The recognition of a clean, healthy, sustainable environment as a human right. So we acknowledge, the resolution acknowledges the reality that is there for all of us all the time. The air we breathe, the food we eat, the water we drink, indeed, our health, well-being, and survival all depend on a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. So as Mark already said, in addition to recognition by the Human Rights Council, more than 150 countries recognize and protect the right to a healthy environment through their constitutions or national laws, judiciaries, or ratification of international instruments related. So I certainly agree we should celebrate, but at the same time, let us be aware. We have in recent consensus-based negotiations on the conclusion of the Commission on the Status of Women, the meeting of the subsidiary bodies to the Convention on Biological Diversity and the Political Declaration for UNEP at 50, several governments spoke against the inclusion of explicit references to this right. Human Rights Council Resolution 4813 unequivocally recognizes the human right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment for all people. It also invites governments to further consider the matter at the UN General Assembly. So by recognizing this right, the General Assembly could catalyze more ambitious, coherent, and coordinated action to protect the environment. General Assembly recognition of the right to water and sanitation achieved this, as we just heard. So the word recognition is really significant here. Human rights may be recognized by governments, but they do not emanate from governments. They are rights we have simply because we exist as human beings. They are inherent to us all. As with the rights to water and sanitation, there can be no doubt that a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment is a human right. However, recognition of rights at all levels of law and policy creates better conditions for action and for accountability. In this case, this is not only important, but it's also urgent. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights has placed the triple planetary crisis of nature loss, pollution, and climate change at the top of the human rights challenges in our era. An estimated 1 in 6 premature deaths are caused by pollution. Tens of millions of people are displaced each year by climate change. Biodiversity loss threatens the collapse of entire ecosystems. We need the international community to act with single-minded purpose and solidarity to deploy every possible resource to protect and fulfill the human right to a healthy environment. Failure to rise to this challenge is not an option. Denial is not an option. Delay is not an option. The latest reports of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change make it clear that these pathways lead to catastrophe. This is our reality. The UN system has called for action and has been called to action. The Secretary General's call to action for human rights brings together senior UN officials on human rights, the environment, development, and children, among others, to advance the human right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. Unfortunately, continuing harmful practices, insufficient action, and inaction by governments and other duty bearers with respect to protection of the environment threaten the progress needed to protect the environment for all people. Those who have contributed the least to environmental degradation are often those at highest risk of experiencing its worst human rights impact. Environmental degradation disproportionately affects the poor, women and girls, indigenous peoples, persons with disabilities, and children, among others. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has recognized that for people in vulnerable situations, a rights-based and inclusive approach to environmental action can make a real difference in their lives while also supporting better environmental outcomes. This is the approach we need to achieve sustainable development that protects the environment and fulfills all human rights. The Human Rights Council's recognition of the right to a healthy environment generated important momentum for this approach, and further recognition can magnify that impact. Ultimately, however, we need more action to realize that right for all people. All around the world, OHCHR and its partners are working to advance the human rights to a healthy environment, enhance the protection of environmental human rights defenders, as we know, a particularly exposed type of human rights defender these days, support rights-based environmental action by UN country teams, raise awareness of the negative human rights impact of environmental degradation, and elevate the voices of those most affected. I encourage your discussion here today to also look beyond recognition toward the action we need to protect the environment for current and for future generations. And OHCHR, of course, looks forward to continuing all our work together to this end. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ilse. inspiring words. And thank you for reminding us that, yes, we're right to celebrate, but there's a huge other mountain to climb now, even after geo-recognition, and that's to make this right meaningful for people around the world, and of course for the environment. And I think your reference to water and sanitation shows the UN resolution isn't a magic wand, but the UN has an unparalleled power to inspire, and this kind of trickle down or normative cascade, as Al called it, really can be seen in the case of water and sanitation, that it was this idea of it's a right to a clean drinking water and sanitation, permeated through so much national legislation, so much national policy, and is now widely recognized around the world. And we're already seeing the same with the right to a healthy environment. Countries like Malaysia now recognize it, follow the Human Rights Council's recognition. Canada, has it recognized it now, or is it still a bill before Parliament? Anyway, Justin Trudeau likes it. So, and the European, there's talk about an optional protocol to the European Convention on Human Rights. So we see this kind of power of the UN to inspire action elsewhere. We're now going to, for the next speaker, we're going to hopefully turn to the video behind me. And we're going to hear from Kellyanne Naylor, who is Associate Director for Water, Sanitation and Hygiene at UNICEF. Over to the video.
The environmental crisis is a child's rights crisis. UNICEF is greatly concerned about the rising number of children exposed to unsafe environments, including those caused by climate change. While exposure harms everyone, children are disproportionately vulnerable to environmental risks due to their unique and rapid stage of development. More than 1.7 million children under the age of 5 lose their lives every year because of avoidable environmental impacts, while millions more suffer disease, disability, and permanent forms of harm. For example, approximately 1 in 3 children, up to 800 million globally, have blood lead levels at or above 5 micrograms per deciliter, a level that has lifelong impacts on children. About 300 million children live in areas where the air is toxic, exceeding international limits by at least 6 times. And almost every child is now exposed to at least one climate or environmental shock globally, with 1 billion children considered extremely high risk to the impacts of climate change. Children's access to a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment is essential for their physical, mental, and social development, from infancy into adulthood, and for the realization of all their rights. Children are claiming their rights and demanding urgent action, but children are frequently left behind when it comes to their meaningful participation in environmental decision-making and action. In the face of these barriers, millions of children and young people across the world have fundamentally changed the face of the environmental movement, demanding urgent action to secure their right to a healthy environment. As we approach ecological tipping points, and as the world seeks to emerge from the COVID-19 crisis, we believe that it is our obligation to listen to them and to place their rights at the center of our efforts to build a healthy and sustainable future. The right to a healthy environment for children is a priority for UNICEF. To support the realization of children's rights to a healthy environment, UNICEF recently launched our global program framework on healthy environments for healthy children, which aggregated available evidence on the impact of pollution and climate change on child development. This framework identifies how UNICEF will help caregivers, the health sector, governments, and various stakeholders take multi-sectoral advocacy and action to deliver results for children's health and well-being. UNICEF is also expanding programmatic work in this area. We are working in countries around the world to protect children's health from environmental degradation and climate change, with a particular focus on pollution's impact to children's health, net zero health systems, and improving primary healthcare systems to adapt to climate change. We are working with governments to ensure that children's rights are reflected in climate, environment, and health policies and action. For example, the Intergovernmental Declaration on Children and Youth and Climate Action, signed by over 30 governments, outlines concrete steps that governments can make to recognize the right to a healthy environment. UNICEF is calling for child-focused adaptation to be a centerpiece of all climate, environment, and health policies as a matter of the highest priority through the creation and implementation of child-centered climate adaptation plans. These adaptation plans must cover child-critical sectors, construct the adaptive capacity of children in their communities, and to consult and include children and capitalize on innovative and alternative funding. Recognition of the human right to a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment by the General Assembly is imperative to protect children's rights. The universal recognition of the right to a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment will be imperative if states are to live up to their commitments to protect people and the planet. UNICEF fully supports the recognition of the human right to a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, and welcomes the recognition of the right by the Human Rights Council in 2021, which represented a major advancement for children's rights globally and a message to children that their voices have been heard. UNICEF now calls on member states to make complete the recognition at the General Assembly. We firmly believe that such recognition will result in greater protection of children's rights. It is necessary to support states in developing stronger and more coherent environmental protection laws and policies, and to empower rights holders, including children, to hold governments to account. I'm looking forward to the roundtable discussions today to take stock of where we are to date, as well as looking at how a General Assembly recognition will reflect on the benefits of healthy children as rights holders around the world. But first, it's important that we hear from the youth themselves, represented today in a video.
Okay. Seems to have been cut off. Was it an internet problem? She was about to introduce a video from a youth activist. As she was, sorry? What? Anyway, as she was about to say, we have a great video from UNICEF, which hopefully will play from a youth activist. And that reflects, as I said before, there was this enormous movement around the world behind UN recognition of the right to, is actually the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, even though there they added the adjective safe. We unfortunately had to drop the adjective safe during the negotiations in Geneva. We can explain why during the panel debates. But really, the child movements, youth movements, they played such an important role. There was one called the Children Environmental Rights Initiative. Unsurprisingly, they were extremely good on social media. There was a global tag for the time is now. And again, it put on enormous pressure on states to act. And so hopefully civil society will again mobilize behind GA recognition. And Charlotte, over to the video of the youth activist.
En Bolivia he trabajado desde el año 2019 en la campaña internacional Mi Planeta, Mis Derechos, bajo una articulación latinoamericana que nació en Bogotá, Colombia. Durante el año 2020, niñas, niños y jóvenes de distintas organizaciones y sectores nos articulamos y organizamos una serie de actividades con el propósito de incluir en la temática social y política el reconocimiento del derecho humano a un medio ambiente sano y saludable. A través del teatro, expresiones artísticas en las calles, concientización de persona a persona, debates y diálogos de validación entre los mismos jóvenes sobre la importancia de contar con este reconocimiento. Hola, soy Adriana Alejandra Salazar Larico. Tengo 22 años. Soy una defensora de los derechos de la madre tierra, los pueblos indígenas, la mujer y la niñez. Soy una joven aymara de abuelos indígenas que emigran a la ciudad de El Alto, una ciudad formada y levantada por migrantes que vinieron en busca de oportunidades al no ver sostenible la producción de alimentos en sus territorios. Los pueblos indígenas son desplazados por los efectos del cambio climático a las ciudades, donde se enfrentan con lógicas distintas, vidas aceleradas, discriminación, racismo y falta de oportunidades. Es por tanto que desde la memoria de los pueblos manifestamos que el cambio climático es un problema económico, social, cultural y altamente político, que merece toda nuestra atención y esfuerzos por garantizar una vida digna a las nuevas generaciones. Es evidente que los efectos del cambio climático no nos afectan a todas y todos por igual. Por ejemplo, a los pueblos indígenas les afecta de mayor forma, al igual que las juventudes y la niñez en general. Nosotras y nosotros como jóvenes hemos emprendido una serie de acciones para resaltar la urgencia por atender la crisis climática desde las calles, nuestros propios espacios de organización e espacios de incidencia. El 10 de septiembre de 2021, como resultado del trabajo de niñas, niños y jóvenes de los 5 continentes, elevamos la petición del reconocimiento del derecho humano a un ambiente sano y saludable mediante la entrega de 1 millón de firmas al relator de Naciones Unidas, David Boyd. Tras estas acciones, logramos sumar a autoridades nacionales y comprometer al Estado plurinacional de Bolivia a ratificar la resolución de reconocimiento del derecho humano a un medio ambiente sano, limpio y seguro, habiendo sumado a la campaña más de 27,000 firmas. Derivada de esta campaña y de otras iniciativas, en mi país se ha logrado constituir la Plataforma de Juventudes por la Justicia Climática, instancia que cuenta con una resolución administrativa del Estado plurinacional, habilitando un espacio oficial de participación en las y los jóvenes en la constitución y toma de decisiones sobre cambio climático. Desde las juventudes bolivianas, el reconocimiento del derecho humano a un ambiente sano y saludable nos acerca a nuestro postulado de justicia climática intergeneracional, considerando que en nuestro país cerca de 2 millones de niñas, niños y jóvenes viven en lugares con amenaza a inundaciones y más de 700,000 en lugares con incidencia de sequía. Condiciones que han afectado a nuestros derechos a la salud, educación, protección y principalmente el derecho a nuestros proyectos de vida futuros, situación que viven millones de niñas, niños, adolescentes y jóvenes alrededor del mundo. Nuestro compromiso con el planeta y la madre tierra se expresa en una serie de acciones e iniciativas que nos inspiran a seguir confiando en la alianza intergeneracional que demanda de los estados asumir su responsabilidad e implementar soluciones estructurales y compartir la misión de superar esta crisis climática para vivir con dignidad hoy y mañana. Agradecemos a David Boyd por sus esfuerzos en esta misión y ratificamos nuestra convicción en la defensa de la madre tierra, nuestro derecho a un medio ambiente sano y nuestro derecho a un futuro mejor.
As you can see, that's energy and passion. I actually downplayed it before. It was over 1 million signatures that were gathered, and I think that's indicative of the incredible mobilization that happened around the world behind this right. Why? Well, because A, it's extremely important for children, especially in the context of intergenerational equity and solidarity. But also it's a positive agenda, and it's been shown where this right exists or has been recognized around the world, that it really does make a difference to individuals, especially, as it also said, individuals in vulnerable or marginalized situations, including in Indigenous people, and it makes a big difference for the environment and for climate. So that probably explains that enthusiasm. I'm so happy, by the way, we could show it. It wasn't sure before we could get this screen down behind us, but it was really worth it, I think, to be able to show that to you all today. So that brings an end to the opening high-level panel. Thank you so much to those of you here and to those who were behind the video, including UNICEF. By the way, there's about 200 people online. Those of you who are online, you're very welcome, even though you're not here in person with us, you're here in spirit. So we appreciate your support and participation. Those online have an equal right to those here to ask questions, to pose comments in the Zoom. And as I said, those will be passed to me and I can pose those questions or comments to the panelists. So now, with the final thank you, we will seamlessly ask the first panel to come.
We have to put all three of those statements on URGs,
Yeah.
maybe CIS's
Yeah.
web pages.
Sorry? Okay, great. Yeah, please have a seat. We have enough seats.
Oh, do we have four? How
Yeah,
many
one
people?
of
Why
us
don't I
will.
move across?
Yeah, then on the next panel, I will, your panel, I'll move.
I'll sit over here. Or maybe I don't need to be here at all. No,
See,
not for this part.
Sorry?
We've got a full house here.
Yeah, it's fantastic. Yeah. Okay, great. It was seamless. So thanks again to the first panelist. Ilse, I know, has to leave us, but it was great she was able to join us. So the first panel will try to look at what's happened so far. As I said, one of the goals of this meeting is a lot of the things we're talking about have happened in Geneva. And those of you who know the United Nations, there's not always a kind of seamless connection and communication between Geneva and New York. So we want to use this panel to explain what's happened so far and to hopefully explain to delegates to the General Assembly why this is important and why this right really would make a difference around the world if it was recognized by the United Nations. And to do so, I can't think of a better group of speakers than we have today, starting with Dr. David Boyd, who is, as you know, the current UN Special Rapporteur. You probably saw the photo of him on Twitter celebrating in the Human Rights Council, which I think went viral. He is the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment, and also a professor at the University of British Columbia in Canada. David, we're all looking forward to your messages to the members of the core group and to all of the state delegates at the General Assembly. Please, over to you.
Well, thanks very much. And thanks everyone for joining us here. I really thought those initial keynotes were fantastic. So thank you for that. And the video from Adriana was actually quite moving. You know, there's so much to say. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, the World Health Organization have all clearly said that we need rapid, systemic, and transformative changes in order to address the global environmental crisis. And that's why it's so exciting to be talking about the role of human rights. Because if we look back through the course of human history to the abolition of slavery, the emancipation of women, the indigenous peoples movements, the end of apartheid in South Africa, we see the powerful role that human rights has played in each of those historic social movements. It's never easy or fast, but human rights are a tool that people can use to bring about those types of transformative changes. And so it's really exciting to be talking about the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment in this context of a global crisis, knowing that it can be a difference maker. And you know, with all due respect, it's not a new human right. It's been part of indigenous legal systems for thousands of years. It was first articulated, not very well, in the Stockholm Declaration in 1972. But in the 1970s, countries began putting this right in their constitutions. Portugal in 1976, Spain in 1978, Peru in 1979. It was put in the African Charter of Human and People's Rights in 1981, the San Salvador Protocol in 1988. And now today, 2022, we know that more than 80% of UN member nations, 156 out of 193, recognize this right. It's constitutionally protected in more than 100 nations. It's protected in environmental laws in more than 100 nations. More than 130 countries have ratified treaties that include the right to a healthy environment. So this is, the resolution of the Human Rights Council was historic in terms of recognizing that everyone has the right to live in a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. But we know that this right makes a difference. What does it mean? It means people have a right to breathe clean air, to have access to safe and sufficient water, healthy and sustainably produced food, healthy ecosystems and biodiversity, non-toxic environments where people can live, work, study, and play, and of course, a safe, livable climate. And the right to a healthy environment also comes with a bunch of participatory rights, including access to information, public participation in decision-making, and access to justice with effective remedies when your right is being threatened or violated. And the right to a healthy environment is interpreted by key human rights principles, including prevention, non-discrimination, and non-regression, which my predecessor, John Knox, articulated so eloquently in his framework principles on human rights and the environment. And we can draw on these decades of experience with human rights at the national and regional levels to say, what kind of a difference does it make? We know that it results in stronger environmental laws and policies, improved implementation and enforcement of those laws and policies, decreased environmental injustices, and most importantly, accelerated progress on the ground. So countries that recognize the right to a healthy environment have reduced air pollution more quickly, have reduced greenhouse gas emissions more quickly, have gained access to safe drinking water for a greater proportion of their population. So that's really encouraging in terms of the magnitude of the challenges we face. It's not a perfect tool, but it has made a difference around the world. And I think that even in recent months, we're beginning to see this right to a healthy environment take on new momentum. So there have been cases all around the world, which I think Maria Antonia will speak about, but cases that have phased out the use of bee-killing neonicotinoid pesticides, that have prevented mining in protected forests where indigenous peoples depend on those forests to live and thrive. Other cases where governments have been required to accelerate action to improve air quality. And on. I could talk about those types of cases, but the real critical importance of taking a rights-based approach to these environmental challenges is that it puts a human face on the problem. You can talk ad nauseum about the fact that 9 million people die prematurely every year from pollution and exposure to toxic substances. But when I show the face of Ella Kissy DeBra, a beautiful British child who died at the age of 9 because of air pollution in London, England, that makes a difference in people's recognition of why this really matters. This really matters to people, to children especially. And so the last thing I want to say is that this rights-based approach not only puts a human face on the problem, it focuses on the most vulnerable and the most heavily impacted by these problems. And it also ensures accountability in a way that, the Achilles heel of things like the Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Paris Agreement, and the Convention on Biodiversity is a lack of accountability and enforcement mechanisms. But when you bring a rights-based approach to play, that can provide mechanisms for accountability. And so, we live in a world where all too often we focus on the differences between us, and those differences are used to tear us apart and divide us. But the right to a healthy environment is something that should bring us all together, because as people who depend on this beautiful blue-green earth for the air we breathe, the water we drink, the food we eat, the ecosystem services that sustain life on earth, we have this in common, this beautiful planet that we call home. So it's absolutely imperative that the General Assembly move as rapidly as possible to recognize the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment so that we can get on with the implementation and the actions needed to protect our beautiful home, this beautiful planet Earth. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. As you can see, it's not only youth climate activists who are passionate about this subject, but really inspiring words. I was planning for each of the panelists after they'd spoken to ask them a question myself, but as we're a little bit behind time, and as we have so many people participating around the world, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to leave the floor at the end of all the speakers for you, both here and online, to be able to ask your own questions rather than hearing me speak anymore, which brings me to the second speaker on the panel. Again, somebody who's been working on this agenda for a long time, the first UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Environment, and Henry C. Lowerman, Professor of International Law at Wake Forest University, and a good friend, Professor John Knox. Please, John.
Thanks, Mark, and thanks to all of you for coming and for all of the other speakers. I got to go before David in this mandate, and you can see now why I'm happy I went before him and not after him normally, because it's very hard to follow him. I'm really happy to be here with you today. I think that this is a historic occasion. This is an occasion that people are going to remember many, many years from now. What the General Assembly is going to do this year, I think. Let me start with a quote by John Kerry in a recent interview he gave. "It is a human right to live with clean air on a planet that is sustainable, and that human right is one that people are fighting for desperately all around the world right now." I'm going to talk about the standard that the United Nations should apply in deciding when and how to recognize so-called new human rights. I agree with David in many ways. This is not a new human right, but it's a new thing for the United Nations General Assembly to recognize the right. At the Human Rights Council session in October, one state suggested that the standard should be that rights should be recognized by the UN only if they're already part of international law. And I hope you realize that can't be the standard, right? Or we would never recognize any rights. If you can only recognize rights that have already been recognized, then you could never have adopted any rights to begin with, right? Including the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Fortunately, though, we don't have to try to imagine what the right standard should be. The General Assembly in 1986 adopted a resolution by consensus, Resolution 4120, that sets out 5 criteria that should be taken into account in deciding when it's appropriate to adopt a new instrument recognizing human rights. So I'm going to go through each of those criteria and explain why recognition of the right to a healthy environment satisfies them. So the first criterion is the right must be consistent with the existing body of international human rights law. The great thing here, I mean, there's a lot of downsides to waiting so long to recognize this right, but one upside is that we have a huge body already of environmental human rights law. There is a lot of content for this right already. This is not a situation in which the right is a kind of empty vessel that we'll have to fill with content later. On the contrary, we have much of the content already for the right. We know what it is. So what is that content? David's already alluded to it, but the way I always think of it is that there's an interdependent relationship between human rights and the environment. A clean, healthy, and sustainable environment is necessary for the full enjoyment of a vast range of human rights, including rights to life and health. At the same time, the exercise of human rights, including rights of freedom of expression and association, rights of information and public participation, rights of remedy, all of that is necessary for people to be able to fight for that healthy environment. So they work together. Protecting human rights helps to protect the environment, which helps to protect human rights. A right to a healthy environment would be a way of expressing in the clearest possible terms that interdependent relationship. It wouldn't conflict with this existing body of international environmental human rights law. On the contrary, it would integrate it and pull it together. It would reinforce it. In particular, it would reinforce it, for example, with respect to the need to protect environmental human rights defenders. As you already heard, environmental human rights defenders are among the most at-risk human rights defenders in the world. In fact, I would say they are the most at-risk human rights defenders in the world. Over 200 every year are killed because of their work. That's an average of more than 4 a week. Many more are harassed, suffer violence, death threats, detained unlawfully, and so forth. Recognizing that they have a right to a healthy environment helps to protect them directly. The second criterion is that the right must be of fundamental character and derive from the inherent dignity and worth of the human person. I don't really think I need to spend very long on that. I think it's very clear that that's true. I just want to note again, we've talked about the 1972 Stockholm Declaration. Let me just quote from it about what it said about this. The Stockholm Declaration said that the natural environment is essential to human well-being and to the enjoyment of basic human rights, even the right to life itself. Again, this is not a new insight. The international community has recognized this for a long time. The third criterion is that the right must be sufficiently precise to give rise to identifiable and practicable obligations. I want to emphasize here that
As you all know, a General Assembly resolution doesn't give rise to legal obligations. It's not a legally binding text the way that a treaty is. However, it does give rise to, and it's very important that it does, give rise to standards that we can then use to try to urge better action and hold people, as David said, in countries more accountable, if not legally, then politically. But where this has been adopted legally, it does give rise and has been construed as giving rise to practicable and identifiable obligations. I think Maria Antonia is going to give examples of that. David mentioned some. And in my own, my last report to the council, the framework principles on human rights and the environment, I tried to set those out in some detail. The fourth criterion is that it must be accompanied by a realistic and effective implementation machinery, including reporting systems. I can't do better than to simply point you at what the representatives of OHCHR and UNEP already said this morning. UN agencies are already working to try to promote implementation and reporting on this right. But recognition by the General Assembly would again reinforce, underline, and further those efforts. Finally, the right must have attracted broad international support. In some ways, this is the easiest of all the 5 criteria. Since the Universal Declaration, there has not been a right. I'll repeat that. Since the Universal Declaration, there has not been a right that has received more international support than the right to a healthy environment. It is the most popular, so to speak, right in the last 75 years. I won't repeat everything that David said, but just to kind of underline it, more than 100 countries have recognized it explicitly in their national constitutions. More than 150 have recognized it either that way or through international, regional treaties. It's been recognized by treaty in Africa, in Latin America and the Caribbean, in the Middle East, in Southeast Asia through declaration, in Europe. This is the most widely recognized human right in the world that is not already mentioned in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It is time for the General Assembly to fill that gap. It is time for the General Assembly to fulfill the promise made 50 years ago at the Stockholm Declaration and recognize this right. It has the opportunity to do something that itself will be celebrated 50 years from now and longer, to add this right clearly and explicitly to the pantheon of human rights that we all have agreed are necessary for human dignity, freedom, and equality. Thank you.
Thank you, John. It may be difficult to come after David here on the panel, but I think that intervention shows why John was such an important and such a successful first UN Special Rapporteur, speaks so clearly and convincingly on what are, for me, complex legal questions as a non-lawyer. And yeah, it's really powerful, really great to have you here, John. As you mentioned, you already introduced, in a sense, the next speaker, Dr. Maria Antonio Tigre, who is the Global Climate Litigation Fellow at the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law at Columbia Law School and Deputy Director of the Global Network for Human Rights and the Environment. Please, over to you. Great to have you with us.
Thank you very much. Well, if it's hard to follow David, following John and David is the real challenge here. But hopefully I can offer some perspectives from Latin America, where I'm from, and talk a little bit about some of the recognition of the right to a healthy environment in Latin America and how that has been implemented through some of the courts in the region. So, the right to a healthy environment was not included in the American Declaration, which is the regional agreement that, sort of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights for the Americas. But it was recognized in the San Salvador Protocol, which came afterwards. But that was only adopted by some countries. It wasn't adopted by all of the countries that have signed the American Declaration. So in 2019, there was a significant advisory opinion that came to the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. As an advisory opinion, it was sort of it was not based on actual facts, but it was a sort of a general question asked to the Inter-American Court. But it was very significant that the court actually did recognize the right to a healthy environment as part of the body of human rights that were adopted within the Inter-American system. And that was very significant, obviously, because it did broaden the recognition of the right to a healthy environment in the region. And a couple of years after, it was adopted by the first contentious case, the Lacat-Honhead case, which was related to indigenous groups in Argentina. So it was, it built on that recognition for the inter-American region. And that's very significant. The Latin America as a whole, as you all know, is a very biodiverse, rich region. And it has some very progressive recognitions of the right to a healthy environment in many constitutions, but the region as a whole has a very significant problem in implementing that right. And I think that's why this recognition by the General Assembly could really boost the implementation for countries throughout the world. But as I'm speaking about Latin America here is one of the examples. It could be specifically significant for that. And I think I just wanted to talk a little bit about two cases that are pending right now in the region that I think really showcase how the right to a healthy environment has been implemented. So Latin America also adopted the Ascosu Agreement that entered into force last year. It's an agreement, regional agreement, after the Aarhus Convention, the second regional agreement on procedural environmental rights. And it's also it's an agreement that was very bold. It talks specifically about the protection of environmental defenders, which has been said about John and David here, how they're the most threatened group of human rights defenders in the world. And in Latin America, has one of the highest numbers of killings of environmental defenders. So it was very significant that that was adopted. And we're going to have the first conference of the parties of the Ascosu Agreement this month, at the end of the month, which will hopefully start to implement the Ascosu Agreement in the region. But it has already shown that, that it has already been cited by courts in the region, and as really sort of the implementation of not only the right to a healthy environment, but all of the procedural environmental rights that come with it. So, there was a case that was filed earlier this year in Argentina related to offshore exploitation of oil and gas and of oil. And it specifically, questioned the permitting procedure of this project, which will really increase the emissions significant, but also affect whales and a lot of the ecosystem that is on the coast of Argentina. And there was a lower court that, relying on the right to a healthy environment and the Ascosu Agreement, that specifically on procedural rights, has stopped the project. It was then reversed, but it was a way that it could that could be questioned as well. And I'm from Brazil, so I think it's only natural that I talk a little bit about what's going on in Brazil, because I think it's also a good example of what the right to a healthy environment can do, and sort of the ways that we can fight when the implementation is not really there, right? So, we obviously know that Brazil has the Amazon rainforest, which is really significant for for the world as a whole, for mitigating climate change. And it was actually said by the Brazilian Supreme Court last week that without the Amazon rainforest, we can't really talk about mitigating climate change. It's that significant for the world as a whole. And Brazil, actually, after the right to a healthy environment was adopted in '88 in our constitution, it's a very beautifully written language. And after that, there were hundreds of laws and policies that were adopted relying on the right to a healthy environment to actually implement that protection in Brazil. And Brazil was doing significantly well. The numbers in terms of the deforestation of the Amazon rainforest decreased significantly. It was really sort of a success case. It was written, although I've spent a lot of my time and my career writing about the protection of the Amazon rainforest and how those policies were actually effective at some point until it wasn't anymore, until we had a government change, and that there were reductions in budgets, in the implementation, and in how the laws were being enforced. So now we've basically gone back to decades of deforestation, of destruction of the Amazon rainforest. So really no implementation of the laws that are there. So there's a lot of cases that are pending within the Brazilian legal system. And 2 weeks ago, the justices, one of the justices of the Supreme Court decided to put 7 cases on, 7 environmental cases on the docket, which was very significant, was very historic. It was the first time that this was ever done. So these are currently pending. I was hoping that I could come here with some great news, but you know, there are 3 cases that were already decided, but unfortunately, one of them, which is the most significant one that I wanted to talk about here, it's a climate case, and it relates to the implementation of a policy, you know, the most significant policy on to tackle deforestation in the Amazon rainforest, which has proven successful, but then the current administration basically stopped implementing it, or at least not implementing it effectively. And then several political parties brought this case to the Supreme Court in Brazil, relying heavily on the right to a healthy environment. And basically what they're asking is for the government to just implement this law. They're not asking the government to do more. They're not asking to change any of the laws. They're just asking them to implement what the government has committed to. And also, like David was saying about the non-regression, which is an essential part of implementing the right to a healthy environment, that was also significantly relied on. And the justice who was giving her main vote, she, you know, wrote a 160-page vote, which is really historic and incredible and beautifully written, talking about the right to a healthy environment and procedural environmental rights and on regression, and how that's an essential part of it, and how we really know the role of the Amazon rainforest for the world and for global mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions. And, you know, it was supposed to be this beautiful historic moment, but then one of the other justices decided to you know, think about how he wanted to vote, so took it out of the docket. So we don't know yet what's going to happen. And, you know, the procedural rules of the Supreme Court in Brazil basically say that he can sit on it for how long as he wants, which is very unfortunate. But, you know, at least I think it's a way for us to fight when we see regression like that, and for implementing it in so many countries, like have been said here, that have already adopted the right to a healthy environment around the world. So.
Thank you, Maria, for bringing us back to the ground and reminding us of the impacts in one particular region, which is Latin America, which has been incredibly progressive on all of these things. And Costa Rica, as you may know, is leading the core group on human rights and environment in Geneva and here in New York. Last but not least, I'm going to give the floor to Esha Mufti, who's head of advocacy at the B team. As I mentioned at the beginning, one of the interesting things of the global push for recognition, first at the Human Rights Council and now with the General Assembly, is it brought together an incredible coalition of actors, including business. And that's pushed by business saying, you know what, we like this as well, and we think this would be useful in terms of our business operations around the world, was led by the B team. Esha is from the B team, so it's going to be really nice to hear from her about the role of the B team in recognition in Geneva, and also this kind of question, which actually is coming up in the chat a lot, about, you know, is this a right where the obligations or responsibilities are only on states, or does it mean something for other actors, non-state actors like businesses? But please, over to you.
Thank you so much. I'm absolutely the least qualified person to be on this panel, but I'm very excited to be with you all. I actually just joined the B team about 3 weeks ago. And as Mark mentioned, the B team is a global collective of business and civil society leaders who are working to create new norms of corporate leadership today for a better tomorrow. So I want to echo my panel fellow panelists. Thank you for everyone that's worked on this so far, including the children's and indigenous rights groups, including the UN agencies, including civil societies, and least but not last, the core group of countries. We are incredibly excited about the progress that this resolution has made to date, and looking forward to helping support in any way that we can ahead of the UN General Assembly. So I want to talk a little bit about the business support for this work. Ahead of the vote last year, the business voice on this had been pretty much silent and absent. And I think a lot of folks and organizations may have taken that as business was opposed to this. My colleagues at the B team who worked on this, by virtue of the work that we do and the business leaders that we work with, we knew that they were committed to raising environmental and human rights standards across their supply chains, committed to work on this, and they weren't really opposed to this. So in partnership with a peer business organization, Business for Nature, as well as the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, we brought together a group of business leaders to sign a statement in support of this resolution ahead of the vote last year. We have 50 signatories, including Unilever, Salesforce, Safaricom, Natura, Adidas. And one of the things, I think someone earlier mentioned that when this went to a vote, there was thunderous applause, there was a limited negative feedback. One of the things we realized as well was that there was actually no negative feedback from the companies that we reached out to. Some corporates felt like they weren't ready to sign on, but no one had anything negative to say. Overall, very positive support for this resolution, this work. We think that the business voice on this is incredibly important because I think a lot of folks have already mentioned the recognition piece, but also the implementation piece. Business is going to be a key partner in implementing these rights. And I think while recognizing that, it's also important for us to recognize that we're also standing on the shoulders of giants that have come before us. Civil society has been working on this for a long time. Children and Indigenous rights groups have been working on this for a long time. The UN has been working on this for a long time. So really showing our support and collaboration as opposed to trying to take over the agenda has been really important. And I think the rationale, there's a couple of pieces to the rationale. So one, as you'll all have probably seen in headlines, news about inclusive capitalism, stakeholder capitalism, business is increasingly recognizing that it's a part of society. It relies on natural capital as well as healthy societies to be able to operate in a way that's long-term and healthy business. I think increasingly business is also recognizing the interconnection between the environment and social aspects, including human rights. I think just transition is a clear example of this that's been at the forefront of conversation and action lately around, how climate change really impacts the most vulnerable and how you aren't actually going to have an energy transition that's successful in long term if you don't take into account the social effects and impacts of the transition. I think the last rationale for business to be supportive of this is the increased global shift toward standard setting for corporate disclosure on environmental, social, and governance issues, as well as mandatory human rights due diligence. Because of this shift, which we're very supportive of, the time could not be more right to have a rights-based approach that's globally recognized so that you can inform these shifts in standard settings and disclosure. And so we are very much on standby to do whatever we can to support ahead of the UNGA and here to collaborate with all of you. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Esha. I mean, especially coming only 3 weeks into your new job, I have to say I couldn't tell you'd only been doing it for 3 weeks. So I can't wait to see what you're going to be like after 3 years. No, it was great, and again, it was really important in Geneva, the Human Rights Council, especially amongst developed countries. The B team sent letters to number 10 Downing Street and to different heads of government in the European Union, and I heard from many of them that it was one of the things that really swayed them because they were really worried about what would be the impact of this on our economies and on our business communities. And so I think your intervention was extremely important. Okay, so we have about 25 minutes for questions and comments from the floor. We've already had loads actually online, which I've got on my phone, but if we open the floor here first to see if anybody has any burning questions. Yeah, there was. So we'll take one here and then one here and then one at the back, please. Yes. If you could keep it short so lots of people have the chance to speak. Yeah, and introduce yourself, please. Yeah.
Okay. My name is Mary with Fordham Law. So I have a question. Thank you in the first place to the panelists. It was a very powerful presentation. And I've noticed most speakers have mentioned this momentum these near unanimous decision to do this. So we are at this point where there's international support everywhere. And so this resolution highlights really a global consensus, viewing it from environmental issues. My question is, how far do you think we are? Because this is a recognition, it's a springboard, it's the first step, obviously. And the UNGA will really help catalyze this. But how far are we from developing an actual international convention or a legally binding international treaty that would help enforce this? Because recognition is very important, but without application enforcement, it's also still it means we're really far from really seeing some changes in the most basic level. Like in the Aarhus Convention, they have this civil society part of decision-making, access to justice, but that's really good on paper. But at the same time, there are a lot of issues when smaller boots on the ground, members of civil society trying to enforce the Aarhus Convention provisions. There are a lot of problems that we have been seeing in that aspect.
Thank you very much. Actually, it chimes with a lot of the questions we've been getting online. Well, if you could all take notes of the questions, and then at the end, you can respond to those which you feel most qualified to respond to. Second question at the back, if you could keep it short again, and please introduce yourself.
Sure, I'm Puvan Wadwi from South Africa, and I work for an organization called Natural Justice, and we work with the indigenous and local communities in Africa. And I grew up next to a coal-fired plant, so 40% of us from that community have breathing problems. So to say a couple of things, I just think we're living in a pretty strange world. The IPCC report comes out, and what our leaders do is sign oil and gas agreements across the globe. If you look at the map of Africa, every other country has new projects that have been permissions being granted. So we are in court in many countries trying to stop many of these things going on, which we can't afford. But my question is around two things in the report. Firstly, the 3 degrees that we're heading towards. I mean, it's clear we'll way overshoot the 1.5, and we can't rely on our leaders to stop that from happening or take us back. But 2 is the question of colonization and how that's driven us to this crisis point. So my question is, looking at the role of countries, colonizing countries that continue to play in these big multinational operations in Africa and other places, is there a way we can look at some kind of additional liability, responsibility, looking at the right to a healthy environment? Because in many countries, especially in Africa, we've lost complete trust that our governments will enforce any of this. So that's why we're on the streets and in court, but looking at the additional kind of liability of countries in the north that are perpetuating this state that we are in. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Very important question. Will states implement this right? Will they respect it and promote it and protect it? Third question at the back.
Yeah, great questions previously. Carl Burkhardt with One Earth, we're an NGO, works internationally on climate change. I'll ask the elephant in the room question. What would it take to get the US to support this? Since, as we know, US, Russia seem to be in alignment on this one issue of blocking this resolution, even though we know John Kerry is in support of it. Is someone working on the plan, or is that too big of an elephant in the room type question? Feels like the big question to ask.
Yeah, it may or may not be the elephant in the room, but it's a very important question and something that's been preoccupying us for a long time. Are there other questions in the room? Yeah, please. If you could introduce yourself as well.
Yeah, hi. Good morning. My name is Tismi Majoglu. I'm from the EU delegation, and I'm an environmental lawyer for many years, dealt with Aarhus, etc. So I just have a quick question. Hearing your expertise as well, we know that in the European Union, and you know very well, we have the Green Deal, we have the Human Rights Action Plan and democracy, where we are recognizing the links. And also we have the latest priorities for the the UN on human rights, where we really note that we are engaged and we want to see a progress, or at least to be engaged in the progress on a clean, healthy and sustainable environment. But I have three questions, if you permit me. And the one is very, very legalistic. So I don't know if I'm going to get the response today, but everybody wants legal certainty. Business wants legal certainty, states wants legal certainty, everybody. So you talk about accountability. I'm sorry, I cannot see everyone. You talk about accountability. So I just wanted to ask you, is it a word that make people scared? Because how you define environment, where is the framework, how the framework can be really limited, so people could understand and grasp what is this. And here is the causal link as well with environmental damages. And the second question is more political. In case there is a convention, the UN will have also to deal with human resources, monitoring mechanism. So that's also another issue that has to be thought. Maybe I went too far. And before that, the third question is, as you said very well, John Kerry is an environmentalist, of course, and he's going to say a lot, but we have a US government, and we wanted to know what do you think the arguments could be? And it's not only a US, there are probably others that they are quite concerned about this. So what arguments we could all use, or what are your arguments that you would use if you were in the role of negotiators or facilitators of a resolution? Thank you.
Okay, great. Please, yeah.
Thank you very much. Good morning, Anton Wein-Wislotzky from the Austrian Permanent Mission. And I would like to thank all panelists for this very interesting morning, the presentations. I have just one question. We are wondering at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Ministry for Environment if the aspect of the destruction of environment in armed conflicts has been also explored and analyzed in the context of the preparatory work for this Human Rights Council resolution. The question is, I think, pertinent at the moment as well, because of the Russian aggression against Ukraine and the way how the safety of nuclear power plants, was clearly ignored, and how, this is only one conflict. There are many others around the world where in armed conflicts, simply this situation is completely ignored, and then there is human suffering caused by this. So that would be maybe an opening. Maybe that's too much for the UN General Assembly resolution, but yeah, we are also exploring this aspect. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Okay, I will. Do you want to already, a couple of minutes each, respond to those, and then I'll go to the questions from the floor, because we have about 15 minutes. I think we've got time to do that. Let's go the same order then. You go first, David.
Oh,
any other questions?
That's dangerous. Giving me the floor.
We only have like 2 minutes each. So.
Oh boy. Okay, well, I'm going to go in reverse order. I'm going to say that peace is actually a fundamental prerequisite to sustainable development. Peace is a fundamental prerequisite to the enjoyment of human rights. Peace is a fundamental prerequisite to the enjoyment of the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. And what we're witnessing in Ukraine is complete violation of human rights, complete violation of environmental integrity. And I don't think more needs to be said about that. France proposed a global pact for the environment about 5 years ago, which included as its first article, the right to a healthy environment. Met some pretty strong headwinds at the United Nations, to put it mildly. So I think that while the Human Rights Council resolution, the prospective General Assembly resolution represents stepping stones towards eventual legally binding recognition, that's probably a ways off at this point in time, and will require a new generation of diplomats, a new generation of political leaders, in my belief. But really, the action with respect to human rights takes place at the national and regional levels. The international frameworks provide guidance, but the action's happening on the ground. And I really enjoyed your comments about business, because the right to a healthy environment does not block development. I mean, this is a fear that some states have. It does not block development. it blocks unsustainable development. And it's actually a catalyst for sustainable development. And there is no better example in the world. We have two colleagues here from Costa Rica, where the right to a healthy environment was incorporated in the Constitution back in 1994 and marked a turning point in the history of that country. At that time, Costa Rica had experienced decades of deforestation, was down to 25% forest cover. Now, with that catalytic moment of the recognition of the right to a healthy environment, over 50% forest cover in Costa Rica, 30% of the country in national parks, 99% of the electricity in Costa Rica generated by renewables, sun, wind, water, geothermal. And Costa Rica has strong laws that prohibit environmentally destructive activities like open pit mining and offshore oil and gas development. And Costa Rica also is a paradise, a really beautiful country, high levels of literacy, long life expectancy, an example to the world of what it means to take the right to a healthy environment seriously. And it is potentially transformative. So I think we should all learn from the lesson of Costa Rica. Other countries that have come aboard more recently, France is making incredible progress. France recognized the right to a healthy environment in 2004 and has passed world-leading laws, the first country in the world to ban the environmental destructive practice of fracking. One of the first countries in the world to ban the use of neonicotinoid pesticides, the bee-killing pesticides. The first country in the global north to prohibit the export of pesticides to the global south when those pesticides are not permitted for use in the European Union because of health and environmental concerns. One of the first countries in the world to recognize in law people's right to breathe clean air. So that's another example of a country where the right to a healthy environment has really had a catalytic effect. And I'll leave the rest of the questions and the hard ones for my colleagues on the panel.
John, over to you then, the hard ones.
Well, another advantage of going first, as you see, it's shocking, really. So I think I'll try and focus on two or three of the questions, which maybe cover more than one. First, on the question from the Austrian colleague about the environment and armed conflicts, I would point you in particular to the work of the International Law Commission on protection of the environment in the context of armed conflict, which has had a special rapporteur on this and has done a lot of work on it in recent years, especially. On the question of like, how far are we away from a treaty? I guess I would say two things about that. One is I want to emphasize again, we have a lot of treaties already on this. There are a lot of treaties already. So it's not as if we're going from 0 to 100 or something. We already have a lot of binding international law on this. And the second point I would make is, I think it's important not to overestimate how much having another treaty would solve all the problems in the world on this. There is no human right that's somehow been solved simply by adopting a human rights treaty on it. The challenge, as we've been discussing, is actually implementing and carrying out the right on the ground, and that requires a huge amount of work. Part of that can be the adoption of laws, including at the national level, but it's not obvious to me that adding another treaty would necessarily solve the problem. The third point I guess, or the third question I would ask, a couple of people ask about the United States in particular, as you might be able to tell, that is my home country. I guess I would make a couple of points about that. One is, and this applies more broadly than just to the United States, this resolution is not going to be adopted by consensus. No resolution recognizing human rights has ever been adopted by consensus. The Universal Declaration was not adopted by consensus. In 2010, the last time the United Nations General Assembly adopted a quote unquote new human right on the rights on water and sanitation, there were 44 abstentions. There are going to be abstentions on this vote as well, because some countries are always more reluctant to accept a new quote unquote new human right. That's okay. Neither the United States nor any other country has a veto in the General Assembly. I'm not talking about the Security Council, that's a different story, but the General Assembly, they don't have a veto, nor should they, and they know they don't. I'm not suggesting they think anything different from that, but the point is just, it's a big mistake to let the countries that are most reluctant to somehow have an outsized set of influence about stopping or blocking action from the vast majority of countries in the world that want to recognize this right. Those countries eventually, I am confident, will catch up. No one now questions the Universal Declaration. No one, for that matter, questions the right to water, the rights to water and sanitation, even though it was adopted just 11 years ago. Countries will catch up, but you can't wait until the last country is ready to go, or we would not have recognized any human rights over the last 80 years. That can't be the standard. And I think I'll just leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, so maybe I'll answer the question on colonization, which I think was one of the wasn't addressed yet. I think one of the big important pieces of the right to a healthy environment is exactly this extraterritorial obligation part, which I think is just now being sort of delineated a little bit better. The advisory opinion of the Inter-American Court, which I mentioned, was an important advancement related to that, because it did, the Inter-American Court did say that the right to a healthy environment entails these extraterritorial obligations of states, especially if we're talking here about the global north and the global south, and that includes greenhouse gas emissions as well. So, if a country causes damage to another country, however, in whichever way that may be, there is an accountability that can eventually be held here. And I think it's something that we need to be increasingly talking about. This advisory opinion was very significant, but it was the first step in sort of global litigation related to that. But it addresses some of these issues implicitly. And I think if you're even talking about the just transition, which my colleague was talking about now too, I think it creates another aspect to that too, because we obviously have this obligation to decarbonize, but that also needs to be done according to human rights and to all the standards that we've been holding so far, especially in the global south, and especially even if we do have the obligation to mitigate climate change. So there's just an article in the New Yorker a couple of weeks ago talking about the mining that's going to happen in so many countries in the global south because of the requirements for renewable energy and batteries. And that needs to be done fast, but that needs to be done according to human rights as well. So I think the right to a healthy environment just reinforces all of that.
Thank you very much. Aisha, do you have anything?
Yeah, sure. I think there was a question on accountability, whether it scares people, and I'm happy to take that. I think it's best suited to the perspective that I can offer. I think probably accountability can be scary from a business perspective. However, I think what I've learned in partnering with a lot of these companies that are trying to be leaders on environment, human rights, and the social space is that while voluntary work, whether it's action or corporate disclosure, might be easier, if you're really trying to shift norms, accountability is crucial, and not just like self-enforced accountability, because what that allows for is a more like-to-like comparison between what you might be doing and your peers might be doing, and for you to really demonstrate the progress that you're achieving, as well as gaps for you to do better. So I think increasingly we're seeing, while the voluntary piece might be easier, the accountability part of it is just crucial for there to be actual movement, not just when it comes to recognition of these rights, but actual implementation and action.
Thank you very much. Okay, we had loads of questions from many people online. I'll try and go through them as quickly as possible, and then we can try and wrap up for the coffee break in about 11 minutes, which means we're only 5 minutes late, which is not bad. Okay, I'll try and direct them at each of you, but please, if there's some that catch your interest, then do feel free to reply. One was from Victor, who works for a National Human Rights Institution in Sierra Leone. There's actually quite a few people from National Human Rights Institutions, especially in Africa, online. And his question is, what is the role of NHRIs in helping implement this right, explaining to populations this right and what their rights are? Really good question. And what available capacity building supports are there for NHRIs so that they can, GANRI, for example, the Global Alliance, to mobilize NHRIs to help implement and realize this right. The question, who are the duty bearers? Is it just governments, or is there some responsibilities of business or others? Ash has kind of answered that already, but if she wants to touch on it again. We had a question from Adriana in Brazil, I guess directed at David, and it's similar to the question you asked earlier, the first question. Do we need some kind of instrument or mechanism if we're going to be talking about implementation, better monitoring, compliance, and a reporting system, so governments including South Africa. And I also had a question about Serbia saying they're not implementing this right, even though it's in their national legislation. A question for Maria. What does this right, where it exists, mean for Indigenous persons? Has it been used? Has it helped them? Has it empowered them? And also, more broadly, has this right helped involve and ensure the participation of civil society organizations in Latin America? Claudia from Lima, great kind of geographic spread, by the way, in the chat room. The idea of a normative cascade. The question, maybe this is for John, will we see things like the right to a healthy environment now integrated into the global biodiversity framework? Sophia from Ukraine touches on a question we've already heard. Do we need some kind of monitoring mechanism to monitor the destruction of the environment and the violation of the right to a healthy environment in conflict situations? Sophia from the Ukraine Bar Association asked that. Antonia from the European Commission, this is mainly a question for the core group, but if any of you want to answer it, is there a roadmap for the next few months for a resolution at the General Assembly? Will this be put to the vote soon? This was from Antonia from the European Commission. And then Charlene, can we expect, and would it be useful to have things like general comments by treaty bodies about the right? Zoe from Serbia, similar to the question from South Africa. In Serbia, we have this right, but the government is doing the exact opposite of respecting and promoting and protecting this right. So is implementation just a dream, or are there ways of making countries like Serbia promote and protect this right? Fillmore, what are the legal implications for states of this resolution? So John kind of touched on that before. Desiree from the UK, good question this. It touches on the US question as well. What role can citizens and civil society play in a place like the UK to mobilize and press governments that maybe have doubts about this right, to put their doubts to one side and get behind it? And last but not least, Amara, also from Sierra Leone. Could you talk a little bit about the link with climate justice, which is a huge issue of growing importance in Africa, and this idea that Africans have contributed least to many of these environmental and climate crises, yet people there are suffering the most. Okay, let's go the opposite way round then. And so we have 2 minutes each again.
I'll be quicker than that, because I do think I have answered this. In terms of who, is it just state responsibility? I don't think so. I think business will hopefully be a key partner in implementing human right to healthy environment. And I think this statement is a first step in that. And we look forward to collaborating ahead of the UNGA, and then, you know, it's the recognition and then the actual implementation piece of it. So
great, thank you, thanks. Maria, sorry.
I think in terms of the duty bearers, I think we're all duty bearers. You know, citizens, civil society, states, companies, like we're all, we all have a duty to protect the environment, and we all have a right to it. So, you know, it's a two-way street, I think. And in terms of the Indigenous groups, I think it's very significant that this recognition is happening, especially for Indigenous people. Indigenous people hold the majority of the biodiversity of the world, really. There have been numerous studies talking about how, you know, recognizing their lands, and it's really one of the most effective ways to protect forests. And obviously we do have a lot of rights of Indigenous peoples that have been recognized, but that's also not always implemented. In the special relationship that Indigenous groups have with the environment makes this extremely significant. And, you know, we've been seeing a lot, you know, an increasing number of, still small, but increasing number of cases where Indigenous groups are plaintiffs. You know, a lot of these environmental cases that I mentioned in Brazil are related to Indigenous groups as well. So it does really empower them. to ask for more and to have more protection, and for civil society as well. The procedural environmental rights that come with the recognition of the right to a healthy environment really empowers them to be even more active. Civil society has been increasingly important in this recognition as a whole.
Thank you so much, Maria. John, you have your wish. You gave me 4 days. Which was
Okay.
cunningly organized.
I'll try and be brief and hit several of them. So the first question from Victor in Sierra Leone about the role of NHRIs is really important. In my own time as the special rapporteur, I was really struck when I would visit countries about how interested NHRIs were in this issue, and also how much they were receiving complaints and questions from people within their country about the relationship of the environment and human rights. In other words, they were receiving complaints that their human rights have been violated because of environmental degradation. I think the UN is doing more to try and support them, including through UNEP, but I think a lot more could be done in that respect. This is a concrete thing the UN could really do that could help. On reporting, we've already talked about this a little bit, but I would just emphasize that, again, this recognition, as the Human Rights Council recognition has already done, will help the Universal Periodic Review process at the Human Rights Council focus more on environmental issues in the context of human rights. Again, they're already starting to do that, but this recognition will help make that clearer and more uniform. The question from Claudia about the normative cascade, I think Cesar Rodriguez Garavito is going to speak about that in the next panel, and so I'll let him address that. The roadmap for the General Assembly, I also am looking forward to hearing more about that, but I think we'll hear more about that as well later on in this session. The question about general comments about the right, actually, this is a really fascinating area. Treaty bodies are increasingly getting more and more specific about the way that environmental issues interact with human rights issues. And if you wanted to email me directly, or David, we could point you to some specific treaty body general comments on this, but also the work that they're doing in other areas. The Center for International Environmental Law, my friend Dan McGraw's old organization, just came out with a report describing, pulling together things that the treaty bodies have said on climate change and human rights in particular. There's just a lot going on in that area. And then finally, the question about, is there a role for citizens in kind of trying to push their countries forward to put their doubts aside? Yes, absolutely. I would say anything you can do to join your voice to the voices of those who are already raising this issue. Again, over, 1,300, 1,400 civil society organizations have already expressed their support for this. And it absolutely does make a difference, I think, for countries that are on the fence. They want to, it matters, as it should, to governments to know that their people care about this issue. And so if you raise your voice, you make it heard, then they'll listen to that. And so, I'll say again, I began by quoting John Kerry. I could also have quoted President Biden, Vice President Kamala Harris. They both have talked about the right of everyone to live in a healthy environment. That language is being used by politicians in almost every country in the world. So making them draw the connection between the language they're used to using in their speeches and the language that the resolution here could recognize, I think that's a really important link to make, and I really encourage you to go help them make it.
Thanks, John. And just to add to that, pressure on governments really can work. The UK is a great example. The UK in Geneva, negotiations on the resolution was just as skeptical and was probably more vocal even than the United States delegation. In fact, whenever each of them opened their mouths, I was kind of cringing, thinking, oh, what they're going to say now. But ahead of the vote, there were media articles comparing the UK position to the Russian position, saying it was the same position. And the media articles were pointing out that the UK was about to host the COP in Glasgow. And as a consequence of that pressure, the UK ended up rejecting all the Russian amendments and voting in favor. I think they just didn't want to be seen as being aligned with Russia. So a message to everybody online that, pressure, public pressure really can work. Last but not least, David, including these questions about instruments and mechanisms and how to make sure implementation happens in South Africa and Serbia and elsewhere. Which
Well,
are
my
kind of-
colleagues have taken all the easy, fun questions and left me with the drag. So let me come back I want to mention this question about national human rights institutions, because their role really is critical. They have an educational role. They have a role also in many countries in holding governments accountable. There's a global alliance of national human rights institutions that does terrific work and has resources to share with NHRIs at the national level. And there's also regional organizations. So, I've been working with Southeast Asian national human rights institutions, and, they're terrific. Implementation is really one of the most important things that we can talk about. It's one thing to recognize these rights on paper, but implementation is critically important. In theory, in an ideal world, governments would fulfill their human rights obligations. They would pass laws, they would create policies, they would implement and enforce those laws and policies, and they would respect, protect, and fulfill people's human rights. But we don't live in an ideal world. And so that's where citizens and communities and civil society have a really critical role to play in this. And governments don't like to be taken to court, but sometimes that's what you have to do. So in South Africa recently, we have a case, a really important case about a community, Pooven mentioned this, a community living with absolutely terrible air quality for decades, and the government taking no steps. And so 2 environmental justice organizations, based on the constitutional right to a healthy environment, took their own government to court and secured a legal decision ordering the government to enact regulations to improve air quality in the Mpumalanga region, the Highveld region of South Africa within 6 months. So that decision should be implemented by the government of South Africa. That should result in improved air quality. And so that's one, taking governments to court. Another thing to recognize in terms of implementation and monitoring is there's an existing process in Geneva called the Universal Periodic Review, where the right to a healthy environment should be integrated in every single country's review at the UPR going forward. And there's also, John mentioned general comments. There's one of the most important general comments ever is currently being created by the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child, General Comment 26 on child's rights, environment, and climate change. And so, young people around the world are invited to participate in the making of that general comment. There's already been an incredible outpouring of input from young people all across the world, and it's a really important opportunity. I also think I want to respond to the point about climate justice. Obviously, the climate crisis is a human rights crisis, and it really is incumbent, both morally and legally, on the wealthy nations, the large emitters, to rapidly reduce emissions. The IPCC says by half by 2030, but also to pony up money for adaptation. The wealthy nations have not fulfilled their commitment, which I would say is an obligation to mobilize at least $100 billion a year in climate finance. That's a number that's actually more than a decade old. And the real number today in terms of adaptation needs of climate vulnerable nations is much higher. And finally, we have to talk about loss and damage. And this connects to the decolonization question. It connects to the climate justice question. For 29 years, there have been conversations happening at the UN conferences of the parties to the Climate Convention on loss and damage. And still, it was only in last fall that for the first time, a wealthy country put money on the table. Scotland broke the ice, put a few $1 million on the table, but the needs are immense. In my role as Special Rapporteur, I visited Fiji, I visited St. Vincent and the Grenadines. These small island states are being absolutely devastated by the climate crisis with terrible knock-on impacts. They have to spend, the Maldives is spending 40% of its national budget on climate adaptation. Well, where does the money come from for healthcare and education in that case? So, and then the last thing I want to say, it's a question that it's kind of been floating around, which is, do UN General Assembly resolutions, do these resolutions actually make a difference? And I think I just want to follow up on what John said about the 2010 resolutions on the right to water and sanitation. The answer, based on 12 years of experience, is absolutely yes. Countries all over the world, Costa Rica, Fiji, Mexico, Slovenia, Tunisia, have put the right to water into their constitutions, their highest and strongest laws. Countries from Colombia to France have put the right to water into their environmental laws. And most importantly, governments have increased the priority that they're actually implementing the right to water and sanitation. Take Mexico, for example. Mexico was a strong supporter of this recognition. They put the right into their constitution. They have worked to deliver safe drinking water to more than 1,000 rural communities in the past decade. My country, Canada, a good example of how these resolutions have an impact. Canada abstained in 2010 when the vote came to the General Assembly. But when that passed with an overwhelming majority, we reversed our position. And in the past 8 years, the government of Canada has worked hand in hand with more than 120 Indigenous communities that had lived for decades in Canada without safe drinking water. And they now have safe drinking water infrastructure. They have sanitation infrastructure. So it really makes these resolutions are catalysts for change that affect people's lives in very powerful and profound ways. So that's why it's so fundamentally important that the General Assembly move on this and move with swiftness and grace.
Thank you. Thanks. Really amazing questions. Fantastic questions in the room and online, really, and for people around the world. I love that part of hybrid meetings, actually. Dan wanted to say very quickly a word about the US position, which is something that involves him.
Right.
And then we will break for coffee. So Dan.
I'm on the unenviable position of speaking after David now. So there've been a couple of questions about the U.S. position, whether it's the elephant in the room or the elephant and the donkey in the room. Really, it's an important question, and I think we should confront it. First, as John said, this isn't a legal question. This is a policy question. The UN General Assembly resolutions are not legally binding. They're very, very important, no question, but it's not a legal question per se. Second, and this is very important to understand, it's not surprising that the US is opposing this. And really, it's the Russians and the US that are the big opponents now. And why is that? Because this is the traditional position of the US government. We're not a party to the 1966 Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. We're not a party to CEDAW, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. We're not a party to the Convention on the Rights of the Child. One set of evidence. Second of all, if you just look historically, in 1982, we were the only country in the world to vote against the World Charter for Nature. In 1992, this is one of John's first jobs in the State Department, we issued a statement disagreeing with the right to development. In 1996, I and others had to go to President Clinton to override the State Department to get the US to recognize the right to housing. I could keep going. The UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, initially we abstained, the US did. Only later when actually one of my staff convinced the State Department that they'd misinterpreted the document, the instrument, did the US change its position and support it. So it's not surprising, all right? And it's not a legal question, it's a policy question. So if the US doesn't like this, that's the US's opinion. I'm ashamed of that, but it's not something that the US should have undue weight about. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. Okay, we have 11 minutes for a coffee break. We will reconvene at 40, maybe 45, but really on the dot. Dan will be here calling you to order.